Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be finishing off Stave 1 of A Christmas Carol. This is part 4. If you haven't read Stave 1 yet, go read it. If you haven't watched part 1, 2 or 3, go watch them first before you start this video. We are now at the point of I keep saying Bob Marley. I don't mean reggae singer and legend Bob Marley. I mean Marley, the ghost of Marley from Christmas Carol. We're about to meet Marley's ghost and find out what he has to say. In part 1, we went through and looked at how Marley was in his life and how Scrooge treats his worker or clerk, Bob Cratchit. In part 2, we looked at the way that he speaks with his nephew Fred and what a legend Fred is, despite how awful Scrooge is. In part 3, we looked at how Scrooge dealt with some charity workers, how that linked to some of the laws of England in the 1800s. And now we're going to look at Marley, Ghost of Marley, together to wrap this up. So we get just immediately a little bit of a sense of foreboding when, for some reason, Scrooge sees Marley's face instead of his door knocker. You know, this is an old Victorian house. So back then, you know, there weren't doorbells. It was a door knocker. So these big ornate door knockers on the fronts of doors, especially in wealthier houses. And instead of seeing a door knocker, he sees a face of a ghost, a man who's been dead for 7 years. His old business partner, Marley. And he doesn't think too much of it at first. He kind of checks it out for a minute and then sort of dismisses it. He goes, poo-poo. So, you know, he's like, whatever. This is, I don't know why I'm seeing something. Maybe I'm a bit tired, whatever. And we do find out that Scrooge has a little bit of a head cold. He's a little bit under the weather. So maybe in his own mind, it's because he's a bit ill that he's seeing things, or, you know, to me, that would be a red flag. If you were hallucinating the ghost of one of your old friends, I think that that's a bit of a red flag, but he just dismisses it, goes into his house, and as he closes the door with a bang, the sound of the bang resonated or resounded throughout the whole house like thunder. Now, most people would just completely sleep on this line and not analyze it at all. Again, this is the reason you come to my house. For my commentary, this is some high-level stuff. The house is a symbolic of Scrooge himself. The reason that the door closing with a bang goes through the whole house almost cavernously and echoes is because his house is very empty and hollow, and his house symbolically represents him. He is empty and hollow. Yeah, he's devoid of anything meaningful to fill his life. He's empty and hollow. So that is actually really good symbolism, and you could go as far as to call it like a little analogy, or if you want another fancy word, a microcosm. The house is kind of a microcosm of Scrooge, yeah? Or actually, I guess you'd argue it's kind of a macrocosm because it's bigger than Scrooge. But either way, it's linked to Scrooge. The other thing, since I'm just going off the deep end on this quote now, is that the fact that the house, despite being very large and luxurious in terms of its size, is empty, I think is another way that Dickens is commenting on the emptiness of the way that the business class or business owners, factory owners, treat their workers at the time. So sure, they have a lot of money and size of buildings and stuff, but it's empty, it's shallow, it's not got any substance within it if you're not treating your workers well and looking after them. Because as I've said in previous videos, Dickens is fighting for social reform. He's fighting for the upper class and the business owners to treat the business workers much better, give them dignity and fair pay, and treat them like human beings. Common sense to us now in 2024, mostly at least. Anyway, so Scrooge goes up into his room, and it's all dark, and again, the darkness is symbolic of Scrooge, obviously. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. I would say that this also forms a little bit of an irony, because you've got to question the mentality of a guy like this. So his entire obsession is about getting all the money and keeping all the money, but then not spending any of the money, not enjoying any of the money. So his whole life is spent in this cold little office, making a bunch of money, making his worker miserable and not treating the worker well, right? And then going to a miserable little tavern and having a miserable meal, and then coming home to a dark house. Like, do you see the irony? Like, where is the joy in this existence? Like, why are you like this, right? And that again links to something I've mentioned in previous videos, the need for a redemption arc. Scrooge has lost his way. He's forgotten what's important in life, and it's not money and possessions. Nothing wrong with having nice things, but that's not where true life and true living is. He's forgotten that, and he maybe needs to be like his worker Bob who in the previous part was sliding up and down a hill to celebrate Christmas. He's full of Christmas joy and laughter and love, even though he only makes a tiny bit of money and has a pretty bad job. But his life is full of riches because he has a great family. We're going to find that out in later staves. So we've then got the fact, like I said, that Scrooge is ill because he has this little saucepan of gruel. And it says here, Scrooge had a little cold in his head. But the other thing I want you to see here is, notice that Scrooge, again, isn't even enjoying... So he's had this crappy dinner in this crappy tavern. And now he's sat at home having some gruel. Gruel is a very thin, watery oatmeal, or oats, porridge. But very thin. We're not talking like a nice bowl of porridge. We're talking like thin, watery, a few oats in amongst a bunch of hot water, basically. And this is actually what they used to feed the factory workers a lot of the time. They used to feed the factory workers with gruel. And that actually links to another one of Dickens's famous novels called Oliver Twist. So Oliver Twist, one of his most famous novels, right? Oliver goes up to try and get a second helping of the gruel. He's like, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" And the factory worker, the one serving the gruel, can't believe that this little boy would ask for more food, right? But he's actually starving. Anyway, so we've got gruel. Scrooge has been a little bit impacted by the fact that Marley, the ghost of Marley, was in his door knocker, because he double locked himself in, which was not his custom. So we see that as much as he's trying to play the hard man and be like, I'm just hallucinating, I don't know, it's no big deal, he is a little bit freaked out. So this also brings in just another little bit of foreboding and foreshadowing of what might come. And then final thing before Marley actually gets into the scene, the ghost of Marley, is there's within Scrooge's house, around his fireplace, there's a bunch of tiles. Now, the fact they're Dutch, I don't think necessarily means very much. Maybe Dutch tile back then was really expensive, I don't know. But they're covered in Bible stories. Cain and Abel, that's from the book of Genesis. Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers, all the way up to the apostles. So there's all these tiles with beautiful scenes from the Bible, all different stories from the Bible, right? So that also then foreshadows and reminds us that this is a Christmas carol. There is a sort of a Christian foundation to this story, right? And when Scrooge does eventually transform spiritually, it is considered to be a Christmas miracle because he has learned his lesson and he's trying to be a better person now. But what's funny is at this point, he doesn't notice any of these wonderful stories and the lessons you could learn from them. Instead, he just hallucinates and sees the face of Marley on the face of every single one of the characters. So he doesn't see Cain, he sees a face of Marley. He doesn't see Abel, he sees a face of Marley. This one makes me laugh. He doesn't see the Queen of Sheba, he sees a queen, maybe a queen's body, but with the face of Marley on the Queen of Sheba. So he's obsessed with the fact that Marley was there. And that's his focus at this point. And so then Marley comes in, and the first very important thing that we notice about Marley is that he has an enormous metal chain clasped around his middle. Yeah. So he's got and it's very heavy. It's made up of all of these steel parts, and the steel parts are cash boxes and keys and padlocks and ledgers and deeds. And this imagery is very important because what it's basically saying is that all of the greed that Marley had in his life is now weighing him down in the afterlife. And steel is pretty heavy. If you had a bunch of steel objects and a metal or steel chain around your middle, it would slow you down significantly. It would weigh you down. It would be awful. And we get the sense that he can't take this off, right? It's stuck to him forever. So this is obviously an interpretation of hell or judgment. Yeah. So Marley is now dead, and the way that he is being judged is a punishment for his greed, and it is a punishment of all of his greed being physically manifested as heavy steel objects and wrapped around him, and he has to drag those things around him forever. Okay, it's a pretty nasty image. I don't like the picture from this copy that much. I don't think that the chain is big enough. I feel like the chain should be like all over, so we'll just keep going. Anyway, so they have a bit of a conversation, and obviously Scrooge can't believe it. But at the beginning, Scrooge tries again to stay the hard man, and he sort of says, "Oh, you might just be a bit of undigested beef, or a blot of mustard, or a crumb of cheese." So this is him basically trying to make excuses. He's trying to make it seem as though he is rational and there's no way that this can be real. He tries to explain it through science. He's basically saying, "Oh, I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in you. You must just be a hallucination, and maybe it's because I ate a bad bit of beef in my horrible little melancholy tavern, or maybe it's because I'm ill or whatever. So he's trying to rationalize it. He's trying to apply science or logic, but this is not scientific, logical, rational. This is spiritual. And so it's a realm that can't be explained by these disciplines. He is then just destroyed when Marley has had enough and he says, no, I am real. And he raises a frightful cry, shakes his chains, and makes a dismal, appalling noise, like probably a scream or a shout, right? And this noise is so disturbing to Scrooge that he nearly swoons. Now, in the 1800s, you wouldn't typically think of a man swooning. It would have been more usual to imagine a woman swooning or fainting at something extreme. But this is so extreme that he is swooning, or he's at risk of swooning. The next quote is, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. So obviously breast is chest in Victorian here. And so there's this idea that the ghost is also not only screaming and shouting and making Scrooge feel like he's about to pass out, but also that the face of Marley is literally being held together with bandages, and his jaw literally falls down supernaturally far, again to show, look, this isn't a hallucination, this is real. I really am dead. I really am a ghost. I really am in an afterlife. Now, all of this is very Gothic imagery, right? And as I've said in previous videos, the Gothic was very, very popular in the Victorian era. And what was also popular was having Christmas stories at Christmas time. And what a lot of people don't realize is there was a big overlap in Victorian England. This may sound weird to us now in, the 2020s, but it was very normal at that time to tell Christmas ghost stories. That was very common in Victorian times because it kind of combined the two favorite genres of the time, right? The Gothic and Christmas stories. And this again is going into deep context. Dickens wrote a novel that I've mentioned in this series before, Oliver Twist. Most of you have probably heard of Oliver Twist, whether you've read it, seen a TV version of it, movie version of it, whatever. Most of you have probably heard of Oliver Twist. And it was a huge success. It was one of Dickens' first published works. So he made a bunch of money, fame, fortune, everything, right? He then overextended himself a little bit. He was having a growing family, more and more financial commitments. And he then had a couple of less successful books and texts. So you've probably heard of Oliver Twist. You probably haven't heard of Martin Chuzzlewit, for example, right? To be honest with you, I'd barely heard of Martin Chuzzlewit. But that was a much less successful text that Dickens wrote. So you can imagine he made all this money with Oliver Twist. And so he got used to a certain lifestyle, let's say. And then a few of his books sort of flops, didn't make very much money, weren't very successful. But he has all these financial commitments because he made Oliver Twist money before, yeah? So he's now in financial strain, which means that he had to create a book or some kind of work that was popular. So what does he do? He combines the Gothic and Christmas stories and actually the idea of Christmas ghost stories, which were all very popular at the time, to try and create a commercial success, which obviously Christmas Carol is. It's one of the most adapted Christmas stories of all time, I believe. So I just want you to be aware of that when there's all this kind of Gothic, ghostly, ghost story type stuff, it doesn't feel very normal for us now as a modern audience to see the Gothic mixed with Christmas. Just isn't very usual for us. But back then it was incredibly usual to have ghosts with faces falling apart in a Christmas story. So there you go. Marley is insistent to get Scrooge to be afraid and to understand how bad the situation is. He says to Scrooge, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link, yard by yard. So, this is a very depressing kind of message, but there is maybe also a little bit of a silver lining, right? Which is that if this chain was made link by link, yard by yard, maybe it could be unmade link by link, yard by yard, by making good choices. So we have this sense, though, that, look, Scrooge, you also have a big chain. And Marley lays it on pretty thickly. He says, look, Scrooge, your chain was just as full and just as heavy as mine, the one that you see around me, 7 years ago, 7 Christmas Eves ago. Yours was as big as mine at that time. And you have labored on it. You haven't just worked on it, you've labored on it. It's almost like you've worked hard to make your chain much bigger. It is now a ponderous chain. So Ghost of Marley is trying to impress on Scrooge, look, you're in really big trouble. If you die and you don't redeem yourself and get yourself back onto the good side. You are going to be dragging around the biggest chain I've ever seen on your back for the rest of time. Okay. And Scrooge, you would think, and Marley even goes a bit further and says, my existence now, there is no rest, no peace. It is incessant. Incessant just means constant. Incessant torture of remorse. So look, Scrooge, you don't end up like me. You do not want to end up like me. It's a terrible life that I'm living. A terrible life that I'm living. And you need to, he keeps going, and then we'll finally get to the quote that I wanted. I'm going to skip past it actually, but in a nutshell, Scrooge wasn't taking it very seriously. There's a couple of quotes to suggest he isn't taking it very seriously. And that's one of the reasons why Marley is sort of now saying, you know, you need to take this very seriously. And you need to come to the realization, Scrooge, that mankind should be your business. The common welfare of people should be your business. Charity and mercy and forbearance and benevolence, which means kindness, all of these things should be your business, not making money. Making money should not be your main business. Marley is a tragic story because he's learned this lesson now, but he's learned it too late and he can't take it back. Okay. This all links in to a core message from Dickens, because Dickens was criticizing the Victorian business owners, and he was saying you should be trying to build businesses that not only maybe make you some money, there's nothing wrong with that, but that also help mankind and make things better, right? Help human beings and improve. So now I'm going to go even a layer deeper into the context of why this means so much to Dickens himself. So Charles Dickens' dad was unfortunately thrown into something called debtor's prison. Effectively, Dickens Senior, his dad, had so much debt that he couldn't pay it. So he was put into prison, debtor's prison, for his debts. By the way, I mentioned earlier how Charles Dickens, I'm talking about now, is in some financial trouble himself. So maybe in the back of his mind, he's a bit worried about this. But when Dickens' dad went to prison, his family had to go to work because of the poor laws and the idea that if you didn't have money and a way to support yourself, you needed a job, so you get a factory job. Charles Dickens, as a young man, ends up in a boot blacking factory in a terrible, dark, awful conditions, working hours and hours a day, miserable, very, very bad. Dickens was one of the rare examples of someone who went through both sides of society. He was more upper class, upper middle class, fairly privileged upbringing, well educated, but because of his dad's bad mistakes and being thrown into debtor's prison, Scrooge got to actually live as the other half lived, right? As a working class person, until he eventually found commercial success as an author. So he's passionate about trying to improve the lives of the working class because he lived the life of a working class person in the past. Few more. This is a long video. I'm sorry. I'm doing my best. He says, Marley says, you will be haunted. So the word haunted shows that this is not a positive situation that he is being put in. He's being put in a terrible situation, actually. And there is a sense of judgment to this. And the other thing that I want you to notice here is that he is going to be haunted not by one, not by two, but by three spirits. And again, like I've told you a few times in these last few lessons, there are some links to Christianity, which was the predominant religion of the Victorian era. And I think that the reason it's three could have some link to the Trinity, because this is a spiritual redemption that he's going through. He's starting to learn the reason of his existence, and the idea that the reason of his existence is not to just manipulate and bully people and gather up a huge stack of gold for himself, but that actually his life is meant to be about making life a bit better for others and show kindness and mercy, right? So I think the fact that it's three may have a little link to the Trinity. That's a bit of context that you can add there. So Scrooge is not thrilled with this. He says, oh, couldn't I take them all at once and just have it over with, Jacob? So you get the idea that maybe he's a little bit afraid. He doesn't want to go through the tension of three different visitations from three different spirits. And he's upset. He's worried. And I don't blame him. I mean, if someone said, oh, you're going to be visited, if I was already visited by a ghost, which would already be trippy enough, to then be told, oh, you're going to be visited by three more of me. And this hasn't exactly been a positive experience for Scrooge, right? He's been screamed at. He's seen a disfigured, ghostly figure. He's literally nearly swooned, like fainted in fear, right? So he's scared. Ultimately, he does do what Marley says. And we've just got a couple more quotes here and then we'll wrap this up. He doesn't follow Marley out of obedience yet, but out of surprise and fear. Now, the reason that's important is because later on, he starts to follow the ghost of Christmas past and present and future out of obedience. But at the moment, he is still disobedient because he hasn't been transformed at all yet. He hasn't learned the errors of his ways at all yet. So at the moment, he's motivated more by fear than by obedience. And then what does he see as he looks out of the window? He sees the air is filled with phantoms wandering hither and thither, restless and moaning as they went. So this is really an image of hell, an image of punishment or judgment. So these people, these phantoms, many of them are out there and they're all in pain and they're all struggling and they're all restless and they're all miserable, right? And this is what's going to happen to Scrooge if he can't redeem himself and turn himself around. And all of this has just been too much for Scrooge. So at the end, he gets into bed and he falls asleep upon the instant. But I wonder if this is more that he passes out because he's been so deeply affected. And that's my final thought on this. This maybe is a glimmer of hope because at the beginning of Stave 1, Dickens describes Scrooge as someone who warm winds can't warm and cold winds can't freeze. So someone who just doesn't get affected by things. Whereas here we see that Scrooge has been deeply affected by this evening, deeply impacted by this evening. And we get this sense that maybe, just maybe, he'll turn this around. I hope that was helpful. And yeah, we're going to go into Stave 2 in future lessons. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, do consider signing up for that. I've got a bunch more resources that I'll be sharing on the classroom. If you're watching this on YouTube, then there's a bunch of links in the description as well. All right, take care.